This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. Some people really hate classic books, but sometimes in that hatred, they actually have some very interesting things to say about them. So let's get started. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Okay, here we have a one-star review of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and it reads as follows. Thank God this book is ended. I never felt that much relief after finishing a book. This is a nightmare for me. I mean, what exactly is written in this novel? The Great Gatsby is considered one of the greatest American novels of the 20th century. Although, to be honest, I don't care about its hype anymore, I pick F. Scott Fitzgerald's work because I thought it would blow my mind. It did, but not in a prominent way. I'm not one of those readers who didn't finish the book, but I thought at least 3 times to do that. The book is so monotonous that it suffocates me. The characters are ridiculous, and the narration is all over the place, with loose ends. People have different opinions on this book. For some people, it portrays unconditional love. It was plain dumb for me. Jay Gatsby and Daisy love each other, but she married Tom because Jay was away for some time and broke. After 5 years, Gatsby returns with enormous property and wants Daisy in his life. Tom has an extramarital affair. Daisy knows but doesn't care. With the help of Daisy's cousin Nick, Gatsby rekindles his love. Now there are unnecessary details, out-of-the-line characters who are self-centered and egoistic. Everyone is dying and no one cares. This book is only 200 pages long, but it gave me a severe headache. I will never recommend this book to anyone in my life. This book is horrible, annoying, and forces you to smash your head on the wall. So, I think this person, The Great Gatsby is a pretty divisive book. Not necessarily in the sense that I think lots of people think it's rubbish, but in the sense I think lots of people think it's overrated. I'm kind of a Great Gatsby defender. It's not like my favorite book of all time, but I think it does explore some things very, very well. And I made a whole video on The Great Gatsby, but the thing that I think it explores extraordinarily well is like the concept of failure. Not just like failure of the American dream, but like total, abject, near existential levels of failure from almost all of the characters. That's something that I Emile Cioran said about Gatsby's kind of crack up, which is, I think it's called The Crack Up, one of his other works. But I actually kind of took that reading and then applied it to The Great Gatsby. And despite the fact that Cioran thought The Great Gatsby was kind of rubbish, I thought it was very good. And actually, that despite Cioran's dismissiveness, it was the thoughts of Cioran that enabled me to kind of get the most out of it. Because the first time I read The Great Gatsby, I wasn't like massively taken with it. But then with this fresh perspective, suddenly the book kind of came alive to me. So I sympathize with somebody really not enjoying The Great Gatsby all that much. I think some of that is the fact that so many people are forced to read it in school, and I think that reading things in school, sometimes it's great, but sometimes it can just kind of kill your love for a book, especially if, because of like an exam syllabus, you are required to have a particular reading of the novel, which I think is such a shame. I think that's like a real flaw in how we often teach literature. But regarding this person's particular experience with the book, I think that they may have been expecting something slightly different out of it. They say that for some people, the book portrays unconditional love. Now, I've come across a few people who interpret it that way, but I think that The Great Gatsby is, in many ways, a kind of deep reflection on the conditionality of love, right? So, like, and sort of the conditionality of everything. Let's take the characters of Tom and Gatsby. So both of them, in their own ways, spend an extraordinary amount of time in the novel attempting to insulate themselves from the rest of the world by use of wealth and material power. This is, I think, very evident in the way that Tom specifically talks about the future. So whenever Tom is talking about the future in the novel, he's always thinks that there's a disaster that's just about to happen. And I think that's because Tom desperately wants to control all of the things in his life, and often can control all the things in his life with money. But he can't control the enormity of chance that stretches out before anyone as they look forward in time. There just is no controlling the entirety of the future, as much as many of us wish that there were. And Gatsby, in many ways, does a very similar thing, right? He's trying to achieve a measure of power and control over his situation, and hopefully, such that he can kind of seduce Daisy over to him via the use of wealth and material power. And that too fails in its own way. But I don't know if I would talk about the novel as an exploration of unconditional love. I think that it's I think that in many ways it's when I say that it's about the kind of conditionality of everything, it's because I think it's about the fragility of many, many things and the kind of powerlessness that we have in the face of things greater than ourselves, or even just in the moment more influential than ourselves. So, there's this moment where Tom is being confronted by, I can't remember his name, which is terrible of me, really. The guy who kind of, spoiler alert for The Great Gatsby, shoots Gatsby at the end, and he confronts Tom with his gun. And in that moment, Tom is just like totally powerless because despite all of his wealth and power, he's confronted with a man with a gun threatening him who has nothing to lose. And I think that kind of moment almost encapsulates what I think the entirety of The Great Gatsby is about, for me at least, which is the ultimate failure of our attempts to build ourselves a kind of impenetrable fortress against the future, and the way that we remain vulnerable in innumerable senses that we just kind of push to the back of our minds because it's kind of horrible and existentially terrifying to think about. I would also kind of want to say a few words in the defense of Daisy here, because I think that Daisy's not a massively likable character, but I think she is a very interesting character. I don't think it's that Daisy doesn't care about Tom's extramarital affair. I think it's that she can't really do anything about it because of her position. I think that in many ways, although one of the kind of tragic parts of Gatsby and Daisy's kind of love story is that they both, I think, honestly, think that they love one another, but for each of them, their love for the other person and companionship with the other person is tied up in a whole host of extra narratives that they might not even be aware of, but nonetheless are sort of behind their actions. So, Gatsby, I think what he sees in Daisy, just as much as kind of the fact that he has like sincerely loved Daisy in the past and no doubt sincerely loves her now, is that there's a kind of victory over his prior condition where he was poor and thus couldn't be with Daisy, and also over Tom, who right now is the kind of living mimetic rival to Gatsby. And Daisy, much in the same way, I think that her desire for Gatsby is very much tied into her relationship with Tom. This is a kind of, at least partly, a way of recouping power from Tom. Tom is having an affair, now she's having an affair. And now she can use the sort of power that Tom had to inspire kind of revulsion's not the right word, but kind of jealousy and dislike in her back on Tom through the person of Gatsby. Weirdly, I think that Gatsby and Daisy's relationship very much has Tom in it from both sides. Gatsby because Tom is a kind of symbol of everything that was standing in the way of Daisy initially, and that now he's hoping through his wealth to surmount. And Daisy because, almost in a much more straightforward sense, she has power over Tom in the same way that Tom once had power over her through his affair. He is doing him the same humiliation that she is doing him the same humiliation that he had done to her. Yeah, I've got all my pronouns in a row there. So I know, I think there's kind of a lot in there, but maybe the reason this person has not particularly enjoyed it is because if they've gone into it thinking that this is a story about unconditional love, then yes, I think they would be incredibly disappointed. And yeah, I think they're right. That there are characters who are self-centered and egoistic. I actually think that the interesting part of The Great Gatsby is how the characters, when they're not acting out of egoistic and self-centered motives, nonetheless, their motives tend to be opaque to them. And it's not necessarily that The Great Gatsby is like totally cynical and that everyone's just always self-centered and always egoistic. But I think that oftentimes the motivations of the characters just are a mystery to them. Like they come up with post hoc rationalizations for why they've done things, and that actually their kind of mental architecture is much more complex and much more imitative than they might think. Yeah, so no, if you're interested in all my thoughts on The Great Gatsby, you can go watch my video on it. But yeah, I think that this is a good example of how I think going into a novel, even what I think is a very good novel and a pretty readable novel as well, with misleading expectations, is going to end up with disappointment. Because if you're going into The Great Gatsby expecting an unconditional love story, and then you're presented with the actual events of The Great Gatsby, then yes, you're going to be pretty disappointed. So I don't know. As I say, the thing that kindled my enjoyment of The Great Gatsby on a second reading was Emile Cioran's kind of philosophy of failure as applied to The Great Gatsby. So I don't know, that would be my recommendation if people out there, really, really don't like The Great Gatsby or want to kind of find something in it, but haven't yet. That would be my recommendation, would be kind of following the line of failure or the thread of failure, even for those characters where it might seem initially it doesn't apply. So, Tom and Daisy are often considered to be victorious, but I also think that they fail in a deep way by the end of the novel because they're stuck in a marriage that they still don't like. They are both of them free. Sorry, they're both of them deeply unfree and remain shackled to their own terrors. Tom remains pretty terrified of the future. He is ultimately failing. And Daisy, likewise, kind of failed in her attempts to recoup power over Tom. They're both miserable. They're stuck in a miserable marriage. Sure, from Nick's perspective, they retreat back into their money, and there's that famous paragraph about that. But I think that we've got to kind of lean on the unreliability of Nick here. We know from everything that we've seen that Daisy and Tom are not happy. They are not victorious. Their failure just isn't as acute as some of the other characters, but it's no less devastating. They're going to spend their entire life miserable, and Tom is going to remain forever anxious about the next kind of social, economic, or political change on the horizon. That's not a very good position to be in. I would recommend The Great Gatsby. I think it's a very good book. But yeah, that would be my overall defense of The Great Gatsby from someone who initially didn't like it all that much and now likes it quite a lot. But before moving on, I just want to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsors, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real hassle. First, you have to choose a domain name and then design the entire thing, and there's always this underlying fear that you're messing it up and creating something that doesn't just look untidy, it actually looks unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They compress all of that complexity into a single platform and use ready-made templates to take all of the complication and pain out of website building. Their block-based Fluid Engine editing system is also very easy to use and makes it incredibly simple to integrate anything you want into your website without having to master some elaborate coding language. You can even set up shops and email campaigns, and you can even edit from your phone. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get a 14-day free trial and 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video. Okay, here we have a very dissatisfied review of Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, and it reads, "Review of the first 200 pages because I can't bring myself to finish it. Maybe one day I'll be more into self-punishment and finish it, but for now I'm done. I don't get it. Maybe I missed the point. Was it supposed to be funny? Because it wasn't. It was complete and utter nonsense. Absolutely unenjoyable." The book follows Patrick, brackets the psycho, and his group of ridiculously idiotic friends. For 98% of the 200 pages I read, Patrick described the clothes he was wearing, his workout routine, or how much every woman he comes across is in love with him. Then he gets together with his friends and it's even worse. They talk about clothes and argue about who someone is that just came into the bar. They seem to know, or at least think they know everyone, but can never agree on who the person is. Then people come up to them and have mistaken them for someone else, but they just go along with it. The other 2% was Patrick, the psycho, fantasizing about murdering people he has interactions with. I couldn't stand it, and I couldn't bring myself to wade through 200 more pages of satirical bullshit. It might have been over my head. I might have missed the point. But do yourself a favor and don't read this. So we can go back and forth on whether American Psycho is a classic, but it's certainly a very influential book in the kind of canon of books written in the past 50 years. And I'm torn about this one-star review because I kind of agree with a fair amount of it. I think American Psycho is a very good book. I think that it's very rich. I think there's lots to talk about. I made a whole video on it. But I did not enjoy the process of reading it. Partly that's because, I don't know, like detailed descriptions of violence kind of like gross me out a bit. Maybe I'm just kind of a bit of a wimp in that regard. But also, I think partly for the reason this reviewer has brought out, which is that American Psycho is very, very repetitive. It has, the narration of it has this incredibly flat way of describing things, and almost purposefully seems to stick to a kind of predictable pace and a predictable tenor of description. And I think that can make it quite frustrating to read. It certainly meant that I probably enjoyed the book less than I've enjoyed a lot of other books. But I will nonetheless defend this decision from an artistic standpoint, because American Psycho, in my view, at its core, is a kind of dark satire. I don't think it's a massively funny satire, though I do think there are really funny moments. I think there are moments where it is a very, very good black comedy. But on the whole, I think it is like a non-comic satire, but it is satirical nonetheless. And I think that I don't want to say monotony, because again, I'm not really saying this as a critique, but the kind of flatness of the prose, I think, is in service to an important artistic and satirical end. Because if we take the character of Patrick Bateman, he is sort of a kind of nihilist in denial almost. He spends his life kind of chasing after appearances and material, etc., etc., etc. But they don't actually make a dent on his world. His world remains flat. It is the kind of featureless plane that some authors associate with nihilism kind of as a philosophy almost. But he's kind of living life that way. And so, yeah, and I think that the fact that he is the person narrating the book and that the description kind of matches this outward mental state, I think can make it a frustrating read. But I think that it is definitely in service to an artistic purpose there. It's not pointless. It is part of the novel. And while I think some people could argue that the novel would be better without it, it's certainly, I think that it is partly to the book's credit that it manages to be satirical, not just in content, but also like in form. Like the book is stylistically reflecting its intended message, which is quite a difficult thing to do. I can't write fiction anyway, but like, even if I could, I imagine that would be one of the more difficult things to do in fiction, because it's matching up style and content in that way just sounds like incredibly difficult and incredibly intricate. So I think that is to Bret Easton Ellis's immense credit that he's able to do that so very well. And again, like you'll notice that the way that even violence is described in the book is often relatively kind of flat and clinical, and I think that too serves an important purpose, right? Because either, depending on how you interpret the book, either Bateman is genuinely enacting these murders or he is escaping into the fantasy of these murders. But either way, these are attempts to kind of add definite topology to the flat plane of his experience. And ultimately, it doesn't quite work. I think the kind of leveling of description also serves that purpose. So yeah, but that being said, yeah, I can totally see where this person's coming from, because I too had a less than pleasant time with the actual experience of reading a lot of American Psycho. Yeah, they're absolutely right. An awful lot of the book is taken up with descriptions of clothes, routines, and especially what other people are wearing. Like that is a total obsession of Bateman's. And it's because like his whole life is this kind of unfulfilling but addictive status game that he's playing with every single person that he encounters. He defines each person fundamentally as either a kind of rival or a subordinate or kind of someone that is kind of an idol. Like he idolizes people like, Donald Trump is like the idol of Patrick Bateman, which kind of has a different tenor now, because this was written long before he was ever involved in politics. But yeah, my point is that Patrick Bateman has this incredibly simplistic view of the world, whereby he is evaluating people primarily through kind of symbolic status markers. And that does mean that his manner of description reflects that. I will say that while this can be frustrating, like I found this like a little bit frustrating when I was reading American Psycho, once you get into it, the book is uncommonly good at making you inhabit a very, very alien mindset. Because Patrick Bateman is describing very ordinary, like, how do I put this? Like a lot of books can get you into an alien mindset by simply being about very alien things. Like, I've been reading the book We recently, which is, I'm planning to make a video on it at some point. It's a very, very good book. It's like a kind of precursor to books like 1984 and Brave New World. It's like the original dystopia in terms of kind of like modern dystopias. And that there you inhabit a very alien mindset. But it's an alien mindset partly in virtue of the fact that it's living in a very alien world to our own. Even though it may resemble it in some ways, it is a very different culture with very different norms than we are used to. And thus you are inhabiting an alien mindset. I think that what American Psycho does so well is that you're inhabiting an alien mindset, even though what the person is describing, like aside from the murder scenes, is like very, very ordinary, like white collar job experience that like, it's not that, most people are exactly in Bateman's position, right? Very few of us are like, I don't know, investment bankers or something, but like his experiences aren't as removed from us as, the main characters in the main character of We, for example. And so I don't know, I think that's a real gift. But yeah, I kind of sympathize with aspects of this review simply because, yeah, like I've read American Psycho once and I haven't reread it because I didn't think it was that pleasant of a reading experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the book isn't great in a whole bunch of ways. But it would have to take something pretty special for me to want to revisit something that I found so very unsettling. But again, I think that I don't think that Bret Easton Ellis would hear me and hear what I've said just now and hear my frustrations with the experience of reading the book and think, that and be like greatly offended by that. Because I think in many ways that seems to be what he's going for. This is yet another example of someone who I think has actually understood the book very well. The person saying this says they might have missed the point. Like, no, I think you are deeply immersed in the point. I just think that you see the point as a flaw when actually I think that you are having what seems to be, as far as I can tell, the intended experience of reading American Psycho. So yeah, no, again, I think that it's yet another example of the kind of insight that can be found in these one-star reviews. But anyway, moving on. Here we have a very interesting review of the complete stories of Franz Kafka, and it reads as follows. Other than the excellent The Metamorphosis, hardly found any of these stories worth the effort. As the book progresses, the stories get more insular, with not much happening outside the character's own head. Ended up skimming the last third in case there was a gem I was missing, didn't find it. So this is a very, very interesting review, partly because I think that one of the cool things about reading Kafka, but also one of the things that people kind of might not be to some people's taste, is actually the kind of blurring of the lines between the outside world and the inside world of Kafka, right? It's not like there are stories that kind of totally and unambiguously take place within a character's head, but the external world that Kafka, or the external worlds that Kafka creates, are so dreamlike and illogical that, I say, it kind of dissolves the boundary between what's going on inside the character's heads and what's going on outside the character's heads, because the worlds do not function in any way like the world that we are used to. It's a totally disorienting experience. And I think this is like a strength of the work, even though I don't think it's necessarily to this person's taste. I think that it is a genuine strength for the uniqueness of reading Kafka. Like I've been doing a bit of reading around Kafka's life. And certainly in his diaries, he is incredibly focused on particular images. Like, he seems to construct his stories with like one vivid image in mind. You see this, I think, in the stories themselves. That image of Gregor Samsa as the beetle. And other authors do this as well. I've been reading a book about Dostoevsky called Dostoevsky and the Process of Literary Creation. And there's some kind of similarity there in the way that Dostoevsky also does this. Dostoevsky but both Dostoevsky and Kafka display this tendency of like having vivid images come to them, like almost fully formed. And then they'll either write down those images, or the image will like nestle inside them for a bit and they'll hold on to it and it will kind of like mature and ripen inside them. And then suddenly it will kind of burst forth and they'll write down an extraordinary story or an extraordinary passage or an extraordinary plan around that image. And I think this is part of what contributes to this dissolution of boundaries, because especially with Kafka, there's a very famous book on Kafka called The Poet of Shame and Guilt, I think. It's something very, very similar to that. And what this author or analyst, I guess, this literary critic makes, the pretty astute, it's kind of a very expanded version of an old observation about Kafka, which is that a lot of his images are transmuted and externalized versions of deep internal struggles that he himself has. And yeah, and I think that the dissolution of the boundary between the inner and the outer world, I think, is a reflection of that. I think it's part of what can be so unique and compelling about Kafka's literature. And I think, when somebody comes away from it saying that the stories get more insular, or some of the stories are very insular with not much happening outside the character's own head, I think that they're really onto something. Because I think that, in fact, I think that part of the route into enjoying Kafka is almost letting go of the division between what's going on inside a character's head and what's going on outside a character's head, and letting those two worlds blend into one another. Partly because, if you're reading Kafka with a mind to sort of understand Kafka himself and the thought processes he went through, I think that can also be very helpful, because so many of these images are externalized and transmuted versions of deep inner feelings that sometimes he's fully conscious of, but sometimes I think literally just come out in this literature. There's a reason why, reflecting on his own writings, I think this is in a letter either to Felice or to Milena, he says, me and my books are one. There is no understanding Kafka without taking in the literature. And I think that I don't know. I think Kafka is such an interesting author to read, partly because, while I think it's worth, digging in and psychoanalyzing and doing all the sort of close analysis of Kafka that people love to do, I think it's also worth sort of stepping back and taking the works at face value. Partly because I think one of the interesting things, maybe I'm just misinterpreting Kafka's diaries here, but when I read Kafka's diaries, one of the things that strikes me is that, although I think that a lot of the work he does is symbolically important and is representative of an inner struggle, I don't think that he always conceives of it in that way. And I think that, as a result, if we're trying to understand, or if we're trying to read Kafka's works with the explicit intention of Kafka in mind, I think that just as important as digging into the weeds is to take a step back and kind of let the totality of the work kind of wash over us. That may be an incredibly wanky thing to say. I've been really seized, and I will make a whole video, not necessarily just about this, but I'll go into this in more detail. There's a painting or an artwork by Salvador Dali, and if you view it from a distance, it's a kind of portrait of Abraham Lincoln, and if you go closer, it's like a naked woman from the back. Dali's muse. And increasingly, I've been thinking about this painting as a kind of metaphor or way of conceiving of literary interpretation more generally, because I have this tendency, and I'm sure many of you have this tendency as well, to really dig into particular phrases. I want to see what this author meant by this one phrase, and especially with someone like Kafka, because his language is so rich and so incredibly infused with symbolism that you can kind of take any part of it and then view the rest of the work through that lens. You could with the Metamorphosis, you could take something like the lodgers, and you could just let's just look at the language around how the lodgers are described, and let's just view the entire story through the symbolic import of the lodgers and their representative of the kind of the other and things like that. Because Kafka's works are so rich and so symbolic, you can kind of do that with almost anything. And I think that is the equivalent of going right up to this painting and looking at all of the details that you can see in the painting up close. But I think just as important, and I think this for Kafka, but I also think this for philosophers like Nietzsche. I think just as important is stepping back and viewing the work almost at a surface level. I don't know, that has such negative connotations, but attempting to take in the general impression that the work as a whole makes on you, and giving an account of that as well. That may not relate so much to this one-star review, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about. But yeah, no, I think this person is onto something, because I think they're right that Kafka's works are very, very insular, and they are expressions of inner torment. I wouldn't necessarily get too hung up on that, because, it sounds strange to say, but just because something's happening inside a character's head doesn't mean that it's not also happening outside of that character's head, and that actually the interplay between the inner and the outer in Kafka is so much more porous than it is in most authors, and especially most naturalistic authors. But yeah, I think again it's an insightful observation to make, but I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing. Okay, here we have a highly critical review of Albert Camus' The Fall, and it reads as follows. I hated every single page of this terrible book. Jean-Baptiste Clément is egotistical, obnoxious, and pretentious, and I couldn't stand anything that came out of his mouth. If I could have reached through the pages and pushed him in a canal, I would have, with an enormous amount of pleasure. A book this short should take me a couple hours tops to read, but it took me weeks to force myself through this overblown drivel. So, this person obviously didn't particularly enjoy their reading experience, and I will say a few words in defense of Camus' The Fall, because it's, I think, one of the most interesting of Camus' works. It's not quite my favorite. The Plague is my favorite, but this is, it's getting there. I think it's a very, very interesting work, and a very cryptic one as well. So, to give everyone some context, The Fall is an extended monologue by a character called Jean-Baptiste Clément, who is, to simplify things slightly, a real misanthrope. He believes that he's seen through to the cynical reality of man and sets himself up as a judge penitent, which again is kind of a complex idea, but if I was to kind of gloss it, it's that he reveals in others and in himself the deep moral shortcomings and what he sees as the kind of dark underbelly of humanity. And in some sense, I think what makes Jean-Baptiste Clément such an interesting character is that he's not onto nothing, right? So when he talks about the fact that humanity and humans often seem like they're compassionate and kind, but really they're fooling themselves and they're out for reputational gain, I don't think he's never wrong there. I think that when he says this is a kind of universal statement, I think he's taking that far too far. But he's clearly onto something. I think that's what makes Clément such an interesting character, is that he's not wholly wrong, but he is not wholly right either. And I don't think that Camus is attempting to put forward Clément as his ideal for this period. This is one of Camus' later works, and it comes after The Plague and the Rebel. So at this point in Camus' philosophy, he is very bullish. I quite like the term bullish. He's very bullish on the concept of togetherness, the existential import of being together and having solidarity with other people, because we're all in the same boat, in his view. We're all facing the abject meaninglessness of reality. And whereas in a lot of his early works, things like The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus, the solitary absurd hero is the kind of main guy, the one who's embodying Camus', I don't want to say ideal, but Camus' positive philosophy at that moment in time. In his later work, it tends to become people bonding together in solidarity with others. So Clément is an interesting case, because Clément is in many ways a return to that original solitary absurd hero, and in some ways is an extreme version of that, because he is so misanthropic. I think, if I remember correctly, in a letter that he writes after the publication of The Fall, Camus replies to a reader to say that The Fall is heavily kind of self-inspired. It's not like autobiographical, because obviously, like, many of the events that happen to Jean-Baptiste Clément don't happen to Camus and didn't happen to Camus. But I think that if we look at Camus' diary entries, we see a real disconnect from the stated philosophy that he really wants to embody and the life he actually lives. Because, as I say, Camus' philosophy by this point has developed into a very solidarity, togetherness-based approach to existential problems. But if we read through his diaries and some of his private writings, I think we can see that Camus himself has not quite reached that point, if that makes sense. Like, he is still often writing in his diaries about the intense frustrations he has with other people, the wish to kind of retreat and to be alone. And I think that, and he views himself, I argue quite rightly, or relatively rightly. I don't want to rag on Camus, but biographically, he does do a fair amount of relatively selfish things. It's not to have a go at him. He's one of my favorite authors, but one ought to call a spade a spade. But my point is that he knows that in many ways he still kind of suffers, as we all do, from a certain level of selfishness and egoism. And I think that the character of Clément is kind of like those qualities that Camus doesn't like about himself, kind of carved off and transformed into this character. And that's not to say that the character is merely condemnatory. Again, I think one of the interesting things about Clément is how he straddles the divide between being like a kind of outright villain, almost villain's probably not the right word, but a kind of anti-ideal, and also the fact that he clearly embodies some of the attractions of egoism and selfishness as well. So I don't think Clément is a straightforward kind of everything Camus hates about himself, but I think there's a lot of that there. I think Camus is analyzing his own kind of darker underbelly. And so when this person says that Clément is egotistical, obnoxious, and pretentious, and I couldn't stand anything that came out of his mouth, I kind of think that they've kind of got it, right? That sort of is what Clément is. And I think that, part of an honest reading, honest is probably too far, I'm not accusing this person of dishonesty, but part of I don't want to say sophisticated. That also sounds like I'm kind of having a go. But I'm going to say sophisticated, but I don't mean this person's unsophisticated. But I think part of a kind of nuanced, let's say nuanced, a nuanced reading of The Fall would be to both recognize the attraction of Clemence, his kind of charisma, his seeming ability to not care about things around him in the sense of, being relatively unbothered by quite a lot. Though, of course, one of the big reveals in the book is that actually he is bothered by a fair amount, but that's kind of by the by. And the fact that he is kind of obnoxious and pretentious and egotistical and cynical in a way that is simplistic beyond belief. I think that part of reading the book is recognizing both the attraction and the drawback of this way of life. I think that Clemence is in many ways the natural successor to people like Meursault and, to a certain extent, the absurd heroes of the myth of Sisyphus. But now, with the benefit of Camus' later intellectual development, he is revealed to be not just have all of the attractions of these earlier pictures, but to have the drawbacks in a full-throated way. This is why I think that The Fall is one of Camus' most interesting works, is because the character of Clemence, I don't think, is like Camus' new positive vision. He's not putting him forward as an argument, because that would be very, very incongruous with all of the other stuff that he writes kind of around before, or kind of recently before and after this. But I also think that because Camus is I think he's a great writer. He's not just going to put in the novel a kind of outright condemnation of Clemence. I think one of the things that Clemence does is challenge you as a reader to challenge him. And I think that's one of the reasons why The Fall is such a great book. I think that we can, in my view, at the very least, sort of sometimes be too expecting of our authors to sort of spell things out for us. Clemence, much like the protagonist of A Hero of Our Time, Pechorin, yes, there is no immediate reply to him. There's no interlocutor in The Fall that kind of calls Clemence out and sort of wags his finger and says, "No, Clemence, you're wrong, and here's why." But I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we, the reader, can't step into that role. I think this is part of what it means to kind of fully and critically engage with a text. And I may be wrong there, but I think that might be one way to get slightly more out of The Fall. I think that, it can be unpleasant to inhabit the kind of twisted monologue of quite an unlikable character. I don't think that necessarily means that it is an impoverished literary quest, I suppose. And yeah, I would highly encourage people to go and read The Fall, because it is really good. It's one of my favorite works by Camus. Here's a 1-star review of Montaigne's essays, and it reads, "If you have a burning desire to learn what Montaigne thought of everything under the sun in minute detail, then this is the book for you. I'm sure there's some hard-earned wisdom somewhere in the book. However, it seems to just be copied from other people, brackets, in Latin, so maybe just read the footnotes. It reads almost like an ancient op-ed, where the references are dated, and while I'm sure incredibly relevant to that day and place, don't really stand up through the centuries." So this is a very interesting observation this person's made about Montaigne's essays, and I actually don't necessarily think that Montaigne would wholly disagree with it, right? There's one of the things Montaigne is incredibly famous for is a kind of intellectual humility to his writings. I'm going to see if I can find it now. In the preface to his essays, he makes almost the exact point this person is talking about here. So, to the reader, the essays of Michel de Montaigne, and it reads as follows. "Reader, here is an honest book. It warns you straight away that I only meant for it to be private, for my family, and never once considered either your service or my reputation. I do not have the strength for such a desire. I wrote it for my relatives and my friends, so that once I'm gone, which may be soon, they may find in it, again, remnants of my personality and thoughts, and remember me in a more complete and lifelike way. Had I been seeking public attention, I would have made myself look better and presented myself more carefully. But I want you to see me as I am, in a plain, natural, and ordinary way, free of pretense and artifice." Now, you can agree with that presentation or not agree with it, depending on how polished you think Montaigne's essays were, because I think in some ways, stylistically, they actually were very polished. He revisited old drafts and all sorts. So, and it may be free of artifice is putting it slightly too strongly there, but I do think there's something in that preface that speaks quite powerfully to Montaigne's own approach to his philosophy and his essays, which is that in basically anything that Montaigne says, in any of his essays, he's always putting it forward with quite a careful self-reflective attitude as to the limits of his own knowledge. This even forms the subject of quite a few of his essays, or at the very least, a major theme of quite a few of his essays. in that he is not at any point saying to the reader, here I am, a great historic genius, declaiming the truth from on high, and you should just dutifully note it down and not question or engage with any of it critically. I don't think that's really in the spirit of Montaigne's essays at all. And I think that one reason why this person might have been disappointed is because it almost sounds like they're reading Montaigne's essays like you would a maths textbook or a kind of history textbook. I've got somewhere on my shelf there a graduate textbook in model theory, and I don't really understand it, but I have it, and I hope to be able to make sense of it at some point when I've got the time. And when I read that, I'm not like questioning it, because I'm not in a position to question the author of a graduate textbook in model theory. And likewise, I've got a great many history books, and when I read those, I'm not a historian. I can't really. I'm not in an epistemic position to engage with it all that critically. To a certain extent, I just kind of have to trust it and hope that the kind of peer review process has ironed out any obvious mistakes. I've got a biography of Franz Kafka that I'm very, very fond of. And the author of that, Rainer Stark, has gone through the archival collections to do with Kafka in incredible detail. And I can't go and check his work there. I just kind of have to take his word for it. So yeah, there are books where, although I think we critically engage with them to a certain extent, we are much more accepting of the information within them. Rainer Stark is effectively saying in his biography of Kafka that although, he doesn't pretend that it's a total and complete biography of Kafka, he is saying, I think all of this is firmly true and will indicate when speculating. And that's kind of the position from which he's talking. He's talking from a position of historic authority, but not from a position of infallibility. I think that the tone of Montaigne's essays is markedly different to that. I think that we can actually take a clue of how to read Montaigne from the way that Montaigne himself reads his own inspirations. As this reviewer very astutely points out, Montaigne's essays are absolutely filled with quotations from classical authors and the various different influences on Montaigne. And he doesn't approach those totally uncritically. What he tends to do is he'll present a kind of quote, and he will engage with that quote. He'll kind of have a conversation with it and use these as effectively dialectical partners to reach his own conclusions. I think that is probably going to be a much more interesting and helpful way to read Montaigne, and also the kind of way that I think Montaigne would want his essays to be read. As I said, a huge theme in his writings is embracing a sort of epistemic humility, which then allows him to read and write quite widely, safe in the knowledge that the reader is not taking him as a kind of prophet or somebody who speaks only the truth, but as someone to be talked with and interrogated, as you would a very clever but ultimately non-authoritative conversational partner. I think that's actually quite a helpful way to read a lot of philosophy, but I think rarely is it so clear as it is in Montaigne's essays that is how he wants you to read him. And so I think that if I was going to sort of say to this person, give it another go, and I think they really should, because I think they've noticed some real key themes in Montaigne's essays, such as the fact that it is Montaigne talking from his own private opinion. It is what he thinks about everything. He's not kind of making a claim to a grand authority. And that he does take great inspiration from other people. And I even quite like the idea of this being a sort of op-ed. I think that almost gives us a clue as to how we might approach Montaigne more fruitfully. I think that we ought to, when we're reading Montaigne, at least this is how I think Montaigne is most helpfully read, we can view him as he viewed his ancient interlocutors, as our own incredibly clever, non-authoritative conversational partner. And then, suddenly, him giving his opinion on such a wide range of topics in minute detail isn't a bad thing anymore. It can actually be a real positive, because what that means is that in Montaigne's essays, which are, my kind of physical copy has his travel diaries in it as well, which are also very good. So it's about kind of 1,200, 1,300 pages. But I think the essays are about 900 pages. We have 900 pages worth of conversational material. It's one of those books that I think is important to read with a notebook by the side so that you can kind of interrogate the text as you're reading it. And then I think the fact that he's willing to expound in minute detail on such a huge range of topics is a positive boon to the reader, because he's not saying that he's an expert on all of these topics. He's not saying that you need to take his word as gospel for all of these topics. He's just providing us with the same kind of inspiration for thought as he was provided by his ancient authors that he so adored. This even comes up in his work on education. He talks about the kind of person that can simply reproduce the quotes of some of the great classical writers of the past, and says, no, that there's something importantly missing from that kind of education, because what one needs to do is learn what they think, while at the same time respecting their own epistemic humility and taking inspiration and involving themselves in dialectic with these other great thinkers. So yeah, I think that this will become a theme with quite a lot of these one-star reviews. They quite often understand the text in quite a deep way. And I think that just a small change in perspective would allow them to get much more out of it. But anyway, moving on. Okay, that's all we have time for today. If you want to check out the previous videos in this series, there's a playlist right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.